Who are you?
You will have to say goodbye eventually. But will you be ready?
So Resident Evil 7 got announced, and I think at first, we were all a bit shocked to see Capcom's choice to actually take a stab at making a disempowering spooky dooky survival horror jaunt again. But honestly, is it all that surprising? Times are tough. Capcom probably don't have that much money to be pumping into giant multi-campaigned third-person shooter action games right now. Considering all these exclusivity deals they're having to do and the fact they can't seem to give me the one thing I want. So what better time than now to make a smaller, more personal claustrophobic title than during a point where a contingent of the Resident Evil fanbase are already upset with the action blockbuster direction the series has been taking. And when these types of games couldn't be more popular with the proliferation of online horror let's plays raking in the cash by playing the scariest games out there. Having your actually scary horror game on a popular let's player's channel, well, that's just free advertising. And I mean, it's already happening with Resi 7. I wouldn't have minded more giant wacky action Resident Evil adventures, but another game in the series that's actually trying to elicit some fear would be just as exciting. The only thing I was afraid of was getting a wishy-washy middle ground title that tried to weave the two elements together. I'm glad Capcom picked a side and a focused direction to take their new game in, and after playing the short demo I can confirm that Resi 7 does stand a chance at being a pretty spooky romp. That said though, I gotta say, this is probably the biggest departure the series has taken, and I'm including the last few games about riding motorbikes over cities and knife fighting in volcanoes. You see, what you gotta remember is that even at the beginning, when Resident Evil was purely a survival horror game, it was also still about hunky trained police officers blowing up giant pale naked men with big ass bazookas. And from my multiple playthroughs of the Resident Evil 7 demo, well, it's hard to imagine any of this lining up with what we know so far about Resident Evil as a series. What we have here is a first-person, VR-ready adventure where a mostly defenseless man explores a rickety house with a slow-moving view cursor. And if that gameplay wasn't different enough already, there's also the matter of how this title presents its horror. Resident Evil 7 is confirmed to be taking place after Resi 6 in the same continuity. But what's happening in this demo is like nothing the series has done before. Resident Evil's monsters have always been of man-made origin, science experiments gone wrong, viruses and the like that escape captivity and mutate those around them. Here though, we get a way more Silent Hill, paranormal type of horror. Characters who walk past doors and disappear, mannequins that show up out of nowhere and move when you're not looking, and even a spooky note appears from thin air after you've watched a VHS tape. Ooh. Resident Evil 4 was originally going to feature some elements of the paranormal, but as we all know, that decision was eventually ditched and the franchise has continued to remain grounded in mad science ever since. The devs have said Resi 7 won't be a ghost story though, and that they haven't thrown out the original sciencey premise of the franchise. I mean, the game's title in the West, guys, is Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. So will our protagonist turn out to be tripping on some new virus, or will there be some Spencer Mansion traps and tricks at play? I mean, this guy probably isn't even the protagonist of the game, so who knows what's going on here. It just comes off as slightly opportunistic to be throwing the series' core premise of tangible real-world threats out of the window for some more unexplainable spooks, in what is probably an attempt to get the same kind of buzz as another horror game teaser released a few years back. PT, as we all remember, was the teaser demo for the next entry in the Silent Hill series before it was eventually cancelled. Like PT, Resident Evil 7 First Hour is a first-person horror experience, set inside a spooky house where cryptic choices and decisions made when exploring will help you uncover more clues and secrets. The game also loops back to the start if you die, so you can continue looking around the place in different ways. It's clear that Capcom want part of that original type of PT buzz, announcing the game and immediately chucking a weird, impenetrable demo to the masses. With Silent Hills dead, I guess that space is right for the taking. The search for all the hidden Easter eggs that will no doubt help make this game the talk of the town online for the coming weeks is still ongoing, but the only thing I'm really concerned about is how much of this is going to be reflective of the final product. We never got to find out with PT, so at first I was wondering if Resi 7 would just be about cryptic Easter eggs and rummaging defenselessly from tiny room to tiny room. There's no gun combat in the demo that I found, so will inventory management for ammo and weapons be a factor like it always was? Apparently yes it will, according to the developer livestream. Something tells me though that when firearms do show up, they're not going to have the tight aim of the firearms of Resi 6 and its mercenaries mode. No word yet on if the game is replayable with an infinite rocket launcher. We know this segment won't be in the final title, but if the gameplay has anything to go on, we'll be seeing seeing at least a fair bit of wandering around looking for secrets and hidden messages elaborating on the world. Discovering secrets and finding out more about Resi's universe and its lore has always been part of the games, but I think it's important to remember what that lore was about and how it's going to affect this new direction. The least spooky moment in the entire demo was probably when I saw that Umbrella logo on the photo of the helicopter, and then suddenly all the memories came flooding back of what universe I'm actually in here. Having any other Resident Evil character in this scenario would drain all tension from it immediately. Do you think Welcome to the Family Guy would survive grabbing Chris Boulder Redfield and punching him in the face? Or what would happen if Jake was running through this place, sliding around parrying spooky ghost chicks? Maybe the cast will be mostly original for this purpose? I get that feeling because the guys who are here feel completely out of place with the original tone of the series. Can you imagine these assholes holding hands as they blow up a giant Shrek monster riding a vertical train out of an exploding underground lava base?
I was an anchor, you know?
Weekend sub, Pete, not anchor.
What's that?
Yeah, probably not. These guys act like such generic horror movie slasher victims. And as realistic as they're trying to make these guys, it actually comes off like slightly more incongruous. Who the hell would be walking around being skeptical about haunted houses and monsters if they lived in the Resident Evil universe?
Do you ever prep? What's the prep? Shitty house, spooky sounds? Ooh, is it haunted?
That all said, the developers have stated that they want to get away from the original protagonists because basically their power levels are too high now. And while it's sad to see them leave, yeah, if they stand any chance of making this series scary again, these guys just gotta go. Honestly though, I'm glad they're not shying away from their continuity. Rebooting for the sake of convenience is so lazy and makes the player kind of wonder what the point of the last million games was. Finding out how this will play into the larger madness of the series has me intrigued to say the least, even if it will probably serve to undermine this new atmosphere. The main question is, if Resident Evil wants to come back and be the top dog of horror again though, is how different will this be from other first-person spookfests out at the moment? What will Resi 7 bring to the table to make it stand apart? This style of horror game is well represented, but what isn't, funnily enough, is tank-controlled fixed-camera angle survival titles. You know what these games actually were back in the day. People may be giving Capcom praise for this quote-unquote bold move, but what would have been a daring turn is to make a current-gen big-budget old-school Resident Evil, and in that sense, I don't think they really took that much of a risk here. Makes me wonder what that Resi 2 remake is gonna look like. Either way, generic sentence incoming, this one's gonna be interesting. Capcom are looking to breathe more life back into this series, and sometimes they're really good at doing that, but sometimes they do miss the mark. A lot of people treat being scary as the only barometer of quality needed to judge a Resi game, but I think that does a disservice to the quality of the mechanics and base components that have made each game so fun up till now. Components that seem to be lacking here for the moment. Map design, item placement, weapons, gear, pacing, that stuff was what made Resident Evil Resident Evil. It's what gave it its quality in all its iterations alongside its wacky premise and lovable characters. So I hope as promised this all does eventually show up, because this all feels very alien right now. Even the style of horror and threats you face here have changed. This is the biggest deviation for the series yet, even more I'd say than when it went over the shoulder in Spain. Despite the changes in gameplay, it's always felt weirdly consistent in its crazy grisly yet weirdly optimistic universe, full of beautiful, perfectly sculpted, hot-blooded American heroes. Here though, that tone seems to be getting switched out for a more sour, gritty approach. As a whole though, I probably would be less interested if this was some kind of reboot and not the next main entry. If this is truly the next Resident Evil and they can keep intact what was great about them while providing some spooky frights, I'm down. But hopefully there's more to it than just running around and looking frightened at things, because I've never been the biggest fan of this style of horror. Survival horror to me is about being on that last clip, rooms away from that last save point, not knowing if you're about to get gobbled up in a split second. And Resident Evil to me means overcoming odds, surviving, and eventually kicking some ass. These horror games were usually based around classic horror tropey movies such as Alien, where things would be scary for the majority of proceedings, but then the protagonists would turn the table and blow the monster to bits at the end, leaving triumphant. There's plenty of time for these things to make their appearance. The mystery surrounding this one is partly why it's exciting me more than usual, especially for a horror game. But at the same time, Resident Evil has always had a unique flair that doesn't seem to be quite present at the moment. Yeah, I know the first Resident Evil did take place in a mansion, but come on, creepy house with spooky man who lives there and kidnaps people? Not really as creative as some of the more recent titles they've been making. I can go to Outlast or Amnesia if I just want to be weak sauce babies getting pushed around for hours, but gotta go to Resi if peeps are gonna get legendary. I'm fine with them introducing some new characters to make the horror spookier, but hopefully this isn't a replacement for the franchise's top charisma. If we can still get that on top of everything else and they don't play it as safe as they are at the moment, maybe I'll be ready for horror to return to its rightful residence.
Absolutely. I think
もう一個だけもう一つ言いたいことがあるんですけど、今回は、QT を一切使ってないです。
Also, I just want to say one last message that there are no quick time events in Resident Evil.
Okay.
7, so I know a lot of people might be relieved to hear that.
Okay, great. I think there's a lot of people that hold you to that. That's good. That's good news.
絶対だね。